I was really rather touched when you called and said you wanted to be on this show, because I know every show in the country has been calling you to come on, and I'm very flattered you'd be here.
Well, you're my buddy, man.
I feel that you're comfortable enough.
I am comfortable.
For 9 seasons, Little House on the Prairie made Walnut Grove feel like the safest place on television. Families gathered around the Ingalls, watched Laura grow up, and believed they were seeing something close to a real family. But the warmth on screen didn't always tell the whole story. Behind the cameras were actors dealing with very different pressures, personalities, ambitions, and private struggles. Some remembered the experience with genuine affection. Others later described moments that were far more uncomfortable. That contrast is what makes the cast story so fascinating today. Even recent retrospectives continue to revisit the show's complicated themes and the experiences of the people who made it. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to separate the fictional family from the real people who created it. Because at the center of everything was one man whose influence reached far beyond the character of Charles Ingalls. His name was Michael Landon, and his story began long before Walnut Grove existed. Long before audiences knew him as Pa Ingalls, Michael Landon had already become one of television's biggest stars. Born Eugene Maurice Orowitz in 1936, he eventually adopted the stage name that would become famous across America. His breakthrough came with Bonanza, where he played Little Joe Cartwright, and spent years becoming a familiar face to millions of viewers. By the time Little House on the Prairie arrived in 1974, Landon wasn't simply another actor being hired for a television series. He already understood how television worked, how audiences connected with characters, and how much power a successful performer could gain. He also moved into writing, producing, and directing, eventually directing dozens of episodes of Little House. That creative control would become one of the most important parts of the story, because Landon wasn't just playing the father at the center of the family. He had enormous influence over the world everyone else had to work inside. There was something unusual about Michael Landon's position on Little House. He wasn't simply Charles Ingalls, the character audiences saw protecting his family. He was also one of the show's major creative forces. He wrote, produced, directed, and starred in the series, with records crediting him as director on 89 episodes. That meant his influence extended into performances, stories, production decisions, and the overall tone of the show. For viewers, this helped create the consistent feeling that Walnut Grove belonged to one carefully controlled universe. But for the actors working inside that universe, such concentrated authority could make disagreements much more complicated. When the person playing your television father is also the person directing and producing you, the usual boundaries can become blurred. Some cast members remembered that relationship warmly. Others later described serious tensions, and those conflicting memories are important because they prevent this story from becoming a simple tale of heroes and villains. The person one actor remembered as a father figure could be experienced very differently by someone else. The biggest controversy surrounding Landon's personal life didn't happen in Walnut Grove at all. It happened within his own marriage. During the production of Little House, Landon began a relationship with Cindy Clerico, who worked on the series as a makeup artist. Landon was married to Lynn No at the time, and the relationship eventually contributed to the end of that marriage. He married Clerico in 1983, and they remained together until his death in 1991. The facts of the relationship are well documented, but the emotional impact was much harder to measure. Landon's public image had been built around dependable fathers, family values, and characters audiences trusted. Suddenly, viewers were forced to reconcile that image with a very complicated private life. It didn't erase his achievements, but it changed how some people viewed him. And that tension between the man audiences thought they knew and the man who existed away from the cameras would follow his legacy for years. Yet his personal life was only part of the controversy. The more difficult question involved how people who actually worked beside him remembered him. Ask Melissa Gilbert about Michael Landon, and the answer is strikingly different from the version remembered by Karen Grassle. Gilbert, who played Laura Ingalls, has repeatedly spoken about the powerful bond she felt with Landon. Her later reflections describe him as an important father figure whose influence remained with her long after the series ended. In 2025, Gilbert publicly marked the anniversary of his death with an emotional tribute and again emphasized the lasting place he held in her life. But Karen Grassle, who played Caroline Ingalls, eventually described a much more difficult working relationship. Her memoir and interviews brought attention to disputes involving salary negotiations and behavior she found inappropriate. That doesn't mean one account automatically cancels out the other. In fact, the contradiction may be the most revealing part. Different actors could experience the same workplace in completely different ways. Gilbert was a young performer who formed an unusually close bond with Landon. Grassle was an adult actress navigating a workplace where Landon held extraordinary creative authority. Their memories don't fit neatly together, and that is exactly why the story becomes even more complicated from here. The final years of Michael Landon's life changed the way many people remembered him. In April 1991, Landon learned that he had pancreatic and liver cancer that could not be surgically treated. He chose to speak publicly about his condition almost immediately, refusing to disappear from the spotlight. Instead of pretending everything was fine, he faced the diagnosis openly and continued discussing his determination to fight. He was only 54. For someone who had spent decades portraying strong fathers and determined men, the news felt almost impossible for longtime viewers to process. Landon continued working on new projects even as his health declined, showing just how unwilling he was to let illness define his final days. He died on July 1, 1991, but his influence never disappeared. In fact, Melissa Gilbert has continued speaking about him decades later. In 2026, she remembered him as a mentor and father figure, showing that the connection she formed with Landon remained deeply important to her. If you're enjoying this deeper look at what happened behind Little House on the Prairie, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the stories coming next become even more complicated. And one of the most revealing chapters involves the girl who grew up calling Landon Pa. Melissa Gilbert was barely 9 years old when she became Laura Ingalls, but the role would follow her for decades. Growing up on a television set meant that millions of people watched her childhood unfold while she was still trying to understand who she was herself. Her connection with Landon became especially important because she didn't see him simply as the show's star. She developed a relationship with him that extended beyond their scenes together. Even decades later, Gilbert has described him with extraordinary affection. In a 2025 interview, she recalled memories from her childhood on the set, while later tributes continued to describe Landon as someone who had a profound influence on her life. But becoming famous that young came with another price. Gilbert eventually had to build an adult identity separate from Laura Ingalls, while constantly being reminded of the character who made her famous. She acted, wrote memoirs, entered politics, and continued working in entertainment. Yet the past never completely stayed in the past. Every new chapter seemed to bring her back to questions about childhood, family, identity, and the people who shaped her. And eventually, some deeply personal discoveries forced her to reconsider parts of the story she thought she already understood. Some of Melissa Gilbert's most difficult revelations had nothing to do with Hollywood. They involved her family. Gilbert was adopted as an infant, and as she grew older, questions about her biological parents became part of the larger story she was trying to understand. One revelation was particularly painful. She learned that the father who had raised her had not died in the way she had been told when she was a child. According to Gilbert's later accounts, She had been told that he died from a stroke, only to eventually discover that he had died by suicide. That discovery changed the emotional meaning of her childhood memories and added another layer to the identity questions she had carried for years. Her willingness to discuss these experiences publicly became part of her later work as a memoirist. Rather than presenting her life as a perfect former child star success story, she acknowledged the confusion, grief, and unanswered questions that came with it. That honesty also helped explain why Gilbert repeatedly returned to her past, in books, interviews, and public appearances. For her, remembering Little House wasn't simply nostalgia. It was also a way of examining the person she had become after growing up in front of America. The years after Little House were not always easy for Gilbert. Behind the familiar smile was a woman dealing with serious financial and physical challenges. In 2015, reports revealed that she faced substantial federal and California tax debts while she was running for Congress in Michigan. Gilbert disputed the idea that she had simply ignored her obligations, explaining that her financial problems were connected to a stalled acting career, divorce, and difficult economic circumstances. She said she had negotiated a repayment plan with the IRS. Her physical struggles were another major obstacle. Gilbert had suffered serious injuries over the years, including spinal problems that eventually required surgery. She had also dealt with the consequences of multiple accidents, and later spoke openly about the impact those injuries had on her life. These setbacks could easily have ended the story of a former child star. Instead, Gilbert kept rebuilding. She continued acting, writing, and developing new projects while finding ways to stay connected with audiences who had known her since childhood. The image of Laura Ingalls remained powerful, but Gilbert was determined to prove that there was much more to her than the character that made her famous. And that became especially important when another relationship from the Little House years came under the spotlight. For viewers, Laura and Mary Ingalls were sisters. Behind the scenes, Melissa Gilbert and Melissa Sue Anderson were two young actresses growing up in the same television world, but their personalities were very different. Gilbert later became one of the most outspoken members of the original cast, openly discussing her childhood, relationships, struggles, and memories of the series. Anderson took almost the opposite approach. She remained much more private and eventually wrote about her experiences in a memoir based largely on her own memories of growing up on television. In a 2010 interview, Anderson explained that she was proud of her time on Little House, but admitted that she did not remember every filming experience clearly because the book was written from memory. Over the years, that difference in personality helped create emotional distance between the two actresses. Anderson once described them as very different people and suggested that she didn't have many memories of the two of them together. Yet time has a strange way of changing old relationships. Decades after they played sisters, reports of reconciliation showed that the distance wasn't necessarily permanent, and that quiet shift reveals something important. Sometimes, the biggest stories from a famous television set aren't the dramatic arguments viewers expected. They're the relationships that slowly changed when the cameras stopped rolling. The story behind Mary Ingalls became increasingly difficult for Melissa Sue Anderson. Her character faced one tragedy after another, especially after Mary lost her sight. Anderson later admitted that some of the storylines became frustrating and overly dramatic. In a 2010 interview, she explained that she eventually felt the role had become too focused on suffering. Her decision to leave wasn't about rejecting the show entirely. She remained proud of the work and the opportunities it gave her, but she wanted control over what came next. Unlike some former child stars, Anderson chose a quieter path rather than constantly reliving her television childhood. That decision would shape how audiences remembered her for decades. After leaving Little House, Anderson continued acting, but she deliberately kept much of her personal life away from the spotlight. When she eventually wrote The Way I See It, She explained that the memoir was based largely on memory, and even admitted that there were scenes she could no longer remember filming. That detail says a lot about how different her approach was from Gilbert's. Anderson wasn't interested in turning every childhood memory into a dramatic revelation. She seemed more comfortable with distance. Her career continued through television and film, while her family life became increasingly private. Years later, that privacy became part of her identity. But while Anderson quietly stepped away from the spotlight, Karen Grassle was eventually ready to discuss what she had experienced behind the scenes. For years, viewers knew Karen Grassle as Caroline Ingalls, the calm and compassionate mother at the center of the family. Away from the cameras, however, she was fighting battles audiences could never see. Grassle later revealed that she struggled with alcohol and depression during the show's run, and eventually began her journey towards sobriety. Her 2021 memoir brought those experiences into the open. She also explained that working with Landon could become extremely difficult. Her account described a demanding workplace where his enormous authority sometimes left her feeling powerless. The contrast was startling. America saw Ma Ingalls as the picture of patience, while Grassle was privately dealing with personal and professional pressures. And then came the dispute that permanently changed how she viewed her time on the series. Grassle's biggest conflict with Landon involved more than personality differences. She said a disagreement over her salary left her feeling insulted, especially because the show had become such a major success. She also described occasions when Landon made crude jokes on set that she found humiliating. In interviews surrounding her memoir, Grassle emphasized that she was describing her own experience of the workplace and the culture of television at the time. Her account doesn't erase the affection other cast members felt for Landon, but it adds another side to his legacy. The man who could inspire extraordinary loyalty could also be demanding and difficult. For years, Grassle kept much of this private. Eventually, though, she revealed something unexpected. Despite everything, the relationship did not end in permanent bitterness. The most surprising part of Grassle's story may be what happened after the show ended. Despite the resentment and painful memories she carried, she and Landon eventually repaired their relationship. Grassle later said she was grateful that they had mended fences before his death. That detail changes the story completely. It means her memories weren't simply about anger toward a former colleague. There was room for forgiveness, complexity, and recognition that Landon was more than one version of himself. He could be talented, generous, demanding, and deeply flawed at the same time. Grassle's experience is a reminder that people can hold conflicting memories of the same person without either story automatically becoming false. But her story was far from the only difficult one among the cast. Another actress carried a secret from childhood that would eventually transform the way she understood her most famous role. Alison Arngrim seemed almost born to play Nellie Oleson. On screen, she was spoiled, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. Off-screen, however, Arngrim was carrying experiences that audiences knew nothing about. In her memoir, Confessions of a Prairie Bitch, she revealed a traumatic history of childhood abuse and explained how performing as Nellie gave her an unexpected outlet for emotions she couldn't easily express elsewhere. The contrast is difficult to ignore. Millions of viewers were laughing at Nellie's outrageous behavior, while the actress portraying her was privately dealing with serious pain. Arngrim eventually turned those experiences into advocacy, speaking publicly about child protection and supporting organizations connected to abuse prevention. Her story became less about escaping her past and more about refusing to let it define her. But playing television's most hated little girl created another strange problem. Viewers began treating Arngrim as though she really was Nellie. The hatred aimed at Nellie Oleson sometimes crossed a line that Arngrim could never have expected. Viewers didn't simply dislike the character. Some reacted to the young actress as if she were responsible for Nellie's behavior. Arngrim has recalled being insulted and targeted by strangers because they couldn't separate the actress from the role. Yet there was an ironic twist. The stronger the audience reaction became, the more successful Arngrim was at doing her job. Nellie was supposed to provoke emotion, and Arngrim did that brilliantly. Over time, she learned to embrace the character rather than run from her. Her memoir turned the infamous Nasty Nellie image into something she could control, while her stage performances and public appearances showed a much more humorous side. Her painful experiences eventually became part of a larger story about survival and advocacy. And another loss would push that transformation even further. Arngrim's life took another major turn after Steve Tracy, who played Nellie's husband Percival, died in 1986 from AIDS-related complications. Their friendship had continued beyond the show, and his death profoundly affected her. Arngrim became involved in AIDS activism, including work connected to AIDS Project Los Angeles, while also continuing advocacy for children. That work gave her fame a completely different purpose. The actress, once known mainly for making audiences furious, as Nellie was now using her public profile to speak about issues that were deeply personal. Her story is especially powerful because she didn't pretend the past had never happened. She carried it with her, but changed what it meant. Even the character audiences once loved to hate became part of her strength. And while Arngrim transformed her difficult past into activism, another Little House actor was looking back at a storyline that feels very different through today's eyes. Dean Butler joined Little House as Almanzo Wilder and became Laura Ingalls' romantic partner. On television, their relationship was presented as a sweet part of Laura's journey into adulthood, but the ages of the actors make those scenes much harder to view today. Butler was 23 when Melissa Gilbert was 15. In a 2024 interview and his memoir Prairie, Butler openly reflected on the age difference and said he wished he had been closer to Gilbert's age when they worked together. Gilbert herself has also spoken about how uncomfortable some of those memories feel looking back. The important point is that the production reflected entertainment standards of another era, standards that many viewers would question today. Butler has not hidden from that uncomfortable history. Instead, he has discussed it directly, adding context to scenes that millions of fans once viewed without thinking twice. And his memoir revealed that his memories of the series were much more complicated than simple nostalgia. When Dean Butler released Prairie Man, My Little House Life and Beyond, in 2024, he opened another window into the world behind the series. Rather than simply retelling famous episodes, Butler reflected on his years as Almanzo, his relationships with the cast, and the strange experience of being permanently associated with one character. He acknowledged difficult moments and regrets, while still describing Little House as an extraordinary gift in his life. That balance is important. Butler wasn't trying to destroy the show's legacy, nor was he pretending everything about the experience was perfect. He was looking back with decades of distance and allowing both truths to exist. The series opened doors that shaped the rest of his career, but it also left him with memories that had become more complicated over time. And just when the story seems to be settling into nostalgia, the next cast member brings an entirely different chapter, one involving a beloved character, a long friendship with Landon, and a career that continued far beyond Walnut Grove. Victor French brought something completely different to Walnut Grove. As Isaiah Edwards, he could look rough around the edges, while still showing enormous warmth and loyalty. French already had a long career in westerns before joining Little House, but the role gave him an opportunity to move beyond the tough guy characters he had often played. The official Little House site notes that Edwards helped break that typecasting. French also directed several episodes, proving that his talents extended well beyond acting. He later reunited with Landon on Highway to Heaven, keeping their professional relationship alive. Sadly, French died in 1989 at just 54 after being diagnosed with lung cancer. His death was another painful reminder that the cast viewers remembered as young and energetic would not remain together forever. But one actress created an entirely different kind of legacy. Catherine McGregor made Harriet Olsen almost impossible to forget. Harriet could be rude, dramatic, and endlessly judgmental, yet McGregor's performance turned her into one of the show's most entertaining characters. Away from Walnut Grove, her life was far more complicated. She came from Colorado, studied drama, and built a substantial acting career before Little House. The official franchise biography also describes her later devotion to children's theater and her spiritual interests. Her story is fascinating because the woman behind Harriet was so different from the character audiences thought they knew. McGregor eventually stepped away from mainstream television and focused much more on creative and spiritual pursuits. She died in 2018, leaving behind a character that remains instantly recognizable decades later. And while Harriet often dominated scenes, the quiet man beside her became just as important. Richard Bull played Nels Oleson, the calm counterweight to Harriet's constant chaos. Unlike his television wife, Nels rarely needed to raise his voice to make an impression. Bull had already spent years working in theater, film, and television before joining the series, and he continued acting long after it ended. The official franchise biography says he later appeared in shows including Knots Landing, Hill Street Blues, and Designing Women, while also reuniting with Landon and French on Highway to Heaven. His personal life was remarkably different from the dramatic stories surrounding some of his co-stars. He and actress Barbara Collentine were together for decades and often worked alongside each other. Bull died in 2014 after complications from pneumonia. His passing quietly closed another chapter of the original Walnut Grove family. Put all these stories together, and a very different picture begins to emerge. Little House on the Prairie was never simply one giant happy family behind the scenes. Some cast members formed lifelong friendships. Some remembered Landon almost like a second father. Others carried painful memories of working with him. Some actors remained deeply connected to the franchise, while others deliberately created distance from their television childhoods. The differences are especially striking because everyone had experienced the same production from completely different positions. Landon had enormous creative authority. The younger actors were growing up in front of millions. Adult performers had to navigate contracts, workplace relationships, and changing careers. That is why reducing the story to one simple version would miss the point. The series was complicated because the people making it were complicated. And today, the legacy is being revisited once again. More than 4 decades after Little House on the Prairie premiered, the show still refuses to disappear. The original series ran from 1974 to 1983 and remains a cultural touchstone, while a new Netflix adaptation has brought the story back to modern audiences. Former cast members are still discussing their memories, and reunions continue to attract actors and fans. That lasting interest proves the show became much bigger than a television series. But perhaps its most fascinating legacy isn't the nostalgia. It's the realization that the people who created America's favorite pioneer family had lives that were every bit as complicated as the characters they portrayed. Some faced grief, some battled private struggles, some carried difficult memories, others found forgiveness and purpose. In the end, Little House survived because viewers believed in its family. Decades later, the real stories behind that family remind us that television can create an image that lasts forever, even when the people behind it were never quite as simple as the characters they played.